The last mail carrier to enter Blackwood Hollow disappeared on October 15th, 1947. His horse returned alone 3 days later, still wearing its postal saddle but carrying no rider, no mailbag, no explanation. The animal's flanks bore scratches from thorns, and its eyes rolled white with terror whenever anyone approached the mouth of the hollow. Sheriff Tom Henley found the mailbag a week later, torn and scattered across a creek bed 2 miles inside the valley. The letters were readable, but they all bore the same return address, Blackwood Hollow, though no one had sent mail from that place in living memory. What terrified the sheriff more than the missing man was what he discovered carved into a birch tree near the scattered mail. 13 notches, each marking a year, each deeper than the last. The final notch was still bleeding sap. For 70 years, the Blackwood family had controlled that mist-shrouded valley with rules no outsider understood. Now someone was counting down to something. Morning fog rolled down from Copper Ridge like funeral shrouds, settling thick in the hollow where the sun never seemed to reach. The scent of wood smoke and something sharper, medicinal and bitter, drifted on air so still it felt solid. Deep in eastern Kentucky's coal country, Blackwood Hollow stretched 3 miles between limestone cliffs that rose like prison walls, trapping sound and light and the 17 souls who called this place home. Ezra Blackwood stood 6'4" in his bare feet, with hands that could snap a man's neck or gentle a newborn calf with equal skill. His beard hung gray to his chest, braided with small bones that clicked when he turned his head. 3 generations of Blackwoods had followed his word as law, and the 4th was learning the weight of absolute obedience. The family compound sat at the hollow's heart, a 2-story log house built in 1873, surrounded by smaller cabins for married sons and their wives. Behind the main house, past the vegetable gardens and chicken coops, stood the teaching barn where Ezra conducted what he called lessons. The barn's windows had been boarded over from the inside. Its doors bore scratches from fingernails, some old enough to have darkened with age, others fresh enough to show white wood beneath. Children learned early that crying brought attention they didn't want. Young Samuel Blackwood, age 9, had stopped making noise altogether after his last lesson. He moved through the compound like a ghost, doing his chores with mechanical precision, speaking only when asked direct questions. His sister Mary, 2 years older, watched him with ancient eyes that belonged in a 40-year-old face. "Time teaches all things," Ezra would say, stroking the bone ornaments in his beard. "Pain teaches faster." No Blackwood left the hollow without permission. No outsider entered without invitation, and no one, family or stranger, questioned Ezra's authority. These laws had governed the valley since Jeremiah Blackwood first claimed the land in 1868, and 3 generations had learned the cost of breaking them. The hollow provided everything the family needed. Clear springs fed vegetable gardens that produced more than mountain soil should allow. Wild game appeared whenever hunters needed meat, as if the forest itself bent to Blackwood will. Women spun thread from plants that grew nowhere else in Kentucky, creating cloth that never wore thin and never faded. Ezra's wife Ruth could set bones and birth babies and brew medicines that cured ailments doctors couldn't even name. But this abundance came with prices that weren't discussed in daylight. Ruth Blackwood had married into the family in 1926, a 17-year-old girl from a neighboring county who thought she'd found love. She learned quickly that love and fear could occupy the same space in a woman's heart. Now 42, she moved through the compound with the careful grace of someone who'd memorized every creaking floorboard, every shadow that might hide watching eyes. Her children, 5 surviving from 8 births, understood that mother's love was conditional on silence. The 3 babies who hadn't lived past their first winter were buried in graves too small to hold growing questions. When Mary asked once where the babies went, Ruth's hand moved to her throat, fingers tracing a scar that disappeared beneath her collar. "Questions breed trouble," Ruth whispered. "Trouble breeds punishment." The men worked timber and hunted, but their real labor was enforcement. Ezra's sons, Daniel, Isaac, and Thomas, ranged the hollow's borders, ensuring no one entered or left without the patriarch's knowledge. They wore rifles like other men wore suspenders, and their boots left tracks in mud that seemed deeper than their weight should make. September brought crisp mornings and the changing of seasons, but it also brought Deputy Marshal Frank Weber to the mouth of Blackwood Hollow. He rode a brown gelding and carried papers from the county courthouse, documents that required signatures and explanations about missing tax payments and unregistered births. Weber had heard stories about the Blackwoods, whispers traded in pool halls and church basement socials. But stories were just smoke, and he was a man who dealt in facts. The fact was that Ezra Blackwood owed the county $97 in back taxes. The fact was that 4 children had been born in the hollow over the past 3 years, with no birth certificates filed. These were problems that could be solved with paperwork and reasonable conversation. The morning mist parted like curtains as Weber urged his horse up the narrow trail. Ancient oaks leaned over the path, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked most of the sky. The deputy noticed how quiet the woods were. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the sound of his horse's hooves on packed earth and his own breathing. 2 miles in, he found Daniel Blackwood waiting in the middle of the trail. "Morning," Weber said, touching his hat brim. "I'm looking for Ezra Blackwood. Got some county business to discuss." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He stood perfectly still, rifle cradled in his arms, studying the deputy with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. Finally, he nodded toward the deeper hollow. "Pa's expecting you." That should have been the first warning. How could Ezra be expecting a visit that Weber hadn't announced? But the deputy followed Daniel's lead, his horse picking its way along a path that grew narrower with each step. The morning sun, which had been bright at the hollow's mouth, seemed to weaken as they penetrated deeper into the valley. The air grew thick with moisture that felt too warm for September, and strange flowers bloomed along the path despite the approaching autumn. Behind them, something large moved through the underbrush, pacing their progress but staying out of sight. The Blackwood compound materialized from the mist like a fever dream. Weber had expected poverty. Most mountain families struggled to scrape by, but this place hummed with prosperity that felt wrong. Gardens overflowed with vegetables that should have died with the first frost. Chickens roamed freely, fat and healthy, but they scattered in absolute silence when the men approached. Even the animals here had learned not to make noise. Ezra emerged from the main house as they dismounted, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who'd never been rushed by another human being. His presence filled the clearing like smoke from a green fire. The bone ornaments in his beard caught what little sunlight penetrated the hollow, throwing tiny shadows across his face that shifted when he breathed. "Deputy Weber," Ezra said, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that made smart men suspicious. "Ruth's got coffee brewing. Figured you'd be tired after the ride." How did he know Weber's name? The deputy hadn't introduced himself to Daniel, and no one had ridden ahead to announce his arrival. But Ezra was already walking toward the house, assuming Weber would follow, and something about the man's confidence made questioning seem foolish. The main room was larger than the cabin's exterior suggested, with hand-hewn beams that disappeared into shadows above. Animal skulls lined the mantelpiece. Deer, bear, and smaller shapes Weber couldn't identify. The walls held weapons, rifles, knives, and tools that might have been farm implements or instruments of discipline. Everything was clean and organized, but the cleanliness felt surgical rather than domestic. Ruth appeared with coffee in cups that matched perfectly, despite being handmade pottery. She moved without sound, setting the service on a table that bore knife scars too regular to be accidental. Her eyes never met Weber's, but he caught her glancing at Ezra's hands, watching for signals the deputy couldn't read. "Now, then," Ezra said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. "What brings the county to our door?" Weber spread his papers on the scarred table, trying to maintain professional composure while every instinct screamed that he should leave immediately. The coffee tasted strange, bitter with an undertone that reminded him of copper pennies. But Ezra waited patiently, stroking his beard, and Weber forced himself to focus on the business at hand. "Back taxes," Weber began. $97 owed to Pike County for the years 1945 through 47. And we need birth certificates for 4 children born in this hollow since January of 1945. Ezra nodded, as if this were perfectly reasonable. "Taxes I can understand. Money's money. But birth certificates?" He leaned forward, and the bone ornaments clinked softly. "What business does the county have with our children? State law requires registration of all births, for record keeping, for schooling when they come of age. Our children get their schooling here." Weber glanced around the room, noting the absence of books, slates, or any educational materials. "The state requires certified teachers, approved curriculum. The state requires lots of things." Ezra's voice remained pleasant, but something had changed in the room's atmosphere. The shadows seemed deeper, the air thicker. "Doesn't mean those things are needed." Through the window, Weber could see children working in the garden. Too many children for 4 births in 3 years. They moved in silence, tending plants with the focused intensity of much older workers. One girl, maybe 11, paused in her weeding to look toward the house. Even at this distance, Weber could see the wariness in her posture, the way she held herself ready to run. That was Mary Blackwood, though Weber didn't know her name yet. "I'll need to speak with the children," Weber said, surprising himself with his boldness. "Verify ages, names, parentage." Ezra's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. Of course, family should always be accounted for. But when Ruth went to call the children in, they came slowly, reluctantly, moving like they were walking toward punishment rather than simple questions. And when Weber looked into their faces, he saw something that made his hand move instinctively toward his sidearm. 5 children lined up in the main room, ages ranging from 6 to 14. They stood with military precision, hands at their sides, eyes fixed on points somewhere above Weber's head. No fidgeting, no whispers, no normal childhood restlessness. They waited like small soldiers awaiting orders. Ezra introduced them with the pride of a man displaying prized livestock. "Mary, age 11, Samuel, 9, Rebecca, 8, Joshua, 7, and little Patience, 6 years old this past spring." Weber pulled out his notebook, trying to maintain the illusion that this was routine paperwork. "Can each of you tell me your full name and birth date?" The children answered in turn, their voices flat and rehearsed. But their responses raised more questions than they answered. Mary claimed to be born in 1936, which would make her 11, but she carried herself like someone much older. Samuel gave his birth year as 1938, then immediately glanced at Ezra as if checking for approval. More troubling were the birthmarks. Each child bore a small, distinctive scar on their left hand, a precise cut between thumb and forefinger that had healed into a raised line. When Weber asked about the marks, the children's uniformity cracked slightly. Rebecca's eyes widened before she could control them. Joshua's hand moved unconsciously to cover his scar. Family tradition, Ezra explained smoothly. Marking ceremony when they turn 5. Shows they're old enough for real responsibilities. But Weber had seen knife scars before, and these weren't ceremonial cuts. They were too precise, too deliberate, and they all showed signs of having been reopened and rehealed multiple times. Someone had been cutting these children repeatedly, systematically. November 3rd, 1947, Deputy Weber's report, found weeks later. Children appear well-fed, but display unusual behavioral patterns consistent with severe discipline or trauma. Recommend follow-up investigation by child welfare authorities. That report was never filed. By November 3rd, Deputy Weber had been missing for 2 weeks. The immediate question was how to proceed without escalating a situation that felt increasingly dangerous. Weber tried a different approach, asking the children about schooling, about play, about the normal activities of childhood. Their answers revealed a world where games were forbidden, where reading meant studying family rules, where the only entertainment was listening to Pa tell stories about outsiders who didn't understand mountain ways. What happens to people who don't understand? Weber asked, immediately regretting the question. Mary looked directly at him for the first time, and her 11-year-old face carried knowledge that made his skin crawl. They learn, she said simply, or they don't. Blood runs thicker than mercy. Ruth served lunch while the children returned to their outdoor work, and Weber found himself alone with Ezra in the main room. The mountain patriarch seemed genuinely friendly, eager to share stories about his family's long history in the hollow. But every anecdote carried undertones that made Weber's coffee taste more bitter with each sip. My grandfather Jeremiah found this place in 1868, Ezra said, refilling Weber's cup from a pot that never seemed to empty. Land was cheap then, after the war. Lots of folks heading west, looking for easier country. But Jeremiah knew mountain secrets that most men don't. What kind of secrets? How to make the land provide, how to keep family together, how to deal with problems that can't be solved with law books and court orders. Through the window, Weber could see the barn Ezra had mentioned earlier, the building where children received their education. Its windows were boarded from the inside, and its heavy wooden doors were secured with iron bars that belonged on a prison rather than a teaching facility. No sounds emerged from the structure, but Weber noticed that the children gave it a wide berth when moving between their various tasks. "Might I see your schoolhouse?" Weber asked, trying to sound casual. Ezra's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Not much to see, just where we conduct lessons." "I'm sure it's fine. State requires inspection of educational facilities, that's all." "State requires lots of things," Ezra repeated, and this time the words carried a weight that pressed against Weber's chest like a physical force. "But we handle our own education here, have for 3 generations, haven't produced any criminals, any troublemakers, any children who forgot their place in the world." The conversation was interrupted by a scream from outside, high, sharp, and cut off so abruptly that it left silence ringing in the air like a bell. Ezra didn't react, didn't even glance toward the window. He continued stroking his beard as if nothing had happened. "Probably just Rebecca," he said calmly. "Girl's been having nightmares lately. Sometimes they spill over into daylight." But when Weber looked outside, Rebecca was clearly visible in the garden, working quietly among the tomato plants. The scream had come from somewhere else entirely. Weber excused himself to visit the outhouse, but instead made his way toward the barn that dominated the compound's back area. The building was larger than it had appeared from the main house, constructed of logs so thick they would have required teams of oxen to move. Iron hinges the size of dinner plates held doors that looked capable of withstanding siege warfare. The smell hit him first, blood and fear and something medicinal that reminded him of the hospitals where he'd recovered from his war wounds. But underneath those scents lay something else, the sweet rot of flowers left too long in still water. The doors weren't locked, though the iron bars suggested they could be secured from the outside. Weber pushed one open just wide enough to slip inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. What he saw made him understand why the children moved so carefully, why they never made unnecessary noise, why they watched Ezra's hands for signals that might mean survival or suffering. The barn had been divided into sections. One area held chains and restraints sized for different ages. Another contained medical instruments that gleamed despite the poor light. Tables bore stains too dark to be anything but dried blood, and the walls showed scratch marks where fingernails had clawed for purchase against smooth logs. In the center of the space, a chair sat bolted to the floor, its arms worn smooth by the grip of countless hands. But it was the wall map that made Weber's breath catch in his throat. Hand-drawn on a large piece of leather, it showed not geographical features, but something far more disturbing. A detailed chart of human anatomy with specific points marked in red ink. Notes in Ezra's handwriting indicated pressure points, nerve clusters, and areas where pain could be maximized without causing death. The map was titled Lessons in Obedience and dated back to 1923. A ledger lay open on a nearby table, its pages filled with entries recording dates, subjects, and methods. The most recent entry was from the previous week. Rebecca, age 8, talking in sleep, 3-minute correction. Result, improved silence. What would you do, standing in that barn with evidence of systematic torture stretching back 20 years? Weber reached for his service weapon, but before his hand found the grip, he heard footsteps approaching the barn, heavy, deliberate, and in no hurry. Ezra appeared in the doorway, backlit by the gray afternoon sky. He studied Weber with the same patient attention he might give a wounded animal. "Finding what you expected?" Ezra asked. Weber's hand hovered near his weapon, but something in Ezra's posture suggested that drawing it would be the last mistake he ever made. The mountain patriarch stepped into the barn, moving with the fluid confidence of a man in his natural element. Behind him, barely visible in the gathering dusk, Weber could see shapes moving between the trees. Ezra's sons, positioning themselves to cut off any escape route. "You're wondering how we maintain discipline without the state's help," Ezra said, settling onto a wooden stool as if he were simply sharing farming techniques. "Most folks think pain is punishment, but pain is just a tool, like a hammer or a plow. You got to know how to use it proper." The bone ornaments in his beard clicked as he gestured toward the anatomical chart. "Took me years to work that out. Started with what my daddy taught me, added what I learned in the war, refined it through trial and error. Now we can correct behavior without leaving marks the county doctor might question." "This is torture," Weber said, finding his voice despite the fear crawling up his throat. This is education. Every child in this hollow learns the same lessons. Obedience protects the family, silence protects the secret, and family protects the land. Without those lessons, we'd have lost this place generations ago. Ezra stood and moved to the wall map, running one finger along the marked pressure points. You think we're monsters, but how many children has the county lost to violence, to sickness, to the kind of want that breaks families apart? How many young ones in your town go hungry while their parents drink themselves blind? How many run wild in the streets because nobody taught them respect? The terrible thing was that parts of Ezra's logic made sense. Weber had seen plenty of broken families, children raised by neglect and violence that was random rather than systematic. But the order in this hollow came at a price that no child should pay. Those children are terrified, Weber said. Those children are alive, safe, fed, protected. They know their place in the world and their responsibilities to family. When they grow up, they'll understand what we've given them. From the compound came the sound of the dinner bell, its clear notes cutting through the thickening mist. Ezra smiled, showing those two sharp teeth. Ruth's calling us to eat. You'll join us, of course. Be rude to refuse mountain hospitality. It wasn't a question. The dining room table could seat 12, though only 8 places had been set. Ezra at the head, Ruth at the foot, the 5 children along one side, and a place for Weber directly across from them. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls, where more animal skulls watched the proceedings with empty eye sockets. The children sat with perfect posture, hands folded, waiting for permission to eat. Ruth served venison that was tender enough to cut with a fork, vegetables that tasted like they'd been picked moments before cooking, and bread that was still warm from the oven. Everything was perfect, abundant, nourishing. But Weber noticed that the children ate mechanically, without pleasure, and that their eyes never left their plates. Conversation flowed around topics that seemed normal: weather patterns, the approaching winter, plans for spring planting. Ezra spoke fondly of his children's progress in their studies, their willingness to help with chores, their respect for family traditions. To a casual observer, it might have seemed like an ideally disciplined household, where everyone knew their role and performed it willingly. But Weber caught the subtle signs. The way Rebecca flinched when Ezra raised his hand to reach for the salt. How Samuel's jaw muscles tightened when his father praised his improvement in recent weeks. The careful distance Mary maintained between her elbow and the man sitting beside her. These children weren't respectful. They were calculating survival with every breath. Deputy Weber was asking about our teaching methods, Ezra said, as Ruth cleared the main course. Seems the county has concerns about our educational standards. Ruth's hands stilled for a moment before she resumed stacking plates. The children's breathing grew shallower, as if the room's oxygen had suddenly thinned. I explained how we maintain discipline through clear expectations and consistent consequences, Ezra continued. How we ensure every child understands their place in the family structure. Understanding is important, Weber managed, though his throat felt constricted. Essential. Children who don't understand tend to make mistakes, and mistakes. Ezra's hand moved to stroke the bone ornaments in his beard. Well, mistakes require correction. The coffee that followed dinner tasted more bitter than ever, with that metallic undertone that made Weber's stomach churn. As the meal concluded, the children asked to be excused with practiced politeness. Ezra nodded, and they filed out in order of age, moving with the synchronized precision of small soldiers. Bedtime is 8 o'clock sharp, Ezra said. Children need their rest. Tomorrow's lessons start early. Through the window, Weber watched Mary herding the younger children toward one of the smaller cabins. Even in the lamplight, he could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she positioned herself between the others and the main house. She was protecting them, he realized. An 11-year-old girl, serving as guardian against her own family. Silence is survival. Weber's sleeping arrangements had been decided without consultation. He would share the main house's spare room, Ezra insisted, rather than riding back to town in the dark. Mountain trails were dangerous at night, and besides, Ruth had already prepared the bed. It would be ungracious to refuse such kindness. The room was clean and comfortable, with a handmade quilt that probably represented weeks of skilled work. A wash basin sat on a wooden stand, and clean towels had been laid out beside it. Under other circumstances, it would have been the kind of mountain hospitality that visitors remembered fondly. But Weber noticed that the window had been nailed shut, and the door latch was the kind that could only be operated from outside. He wasn't a guest. He was a prisoner. Lying on the narrow bed, Weber strained to hear sounds from the rest of the house. Ezra's voice drifted up from the main room, reading aloud from what sounded like scripture, though the words were unfamiliar. Ruth moved through the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner with the efficient silence of long practice. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked with the steady rhythm of time running out. Around midnight, the real sounds began. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate. The creak of floorboards under significant weight. Doors opening and closing with careful precision. And then, from somewhere below, the muffled sound of children's voices, not playing or talking, but reciting something in unison. The words were too indistinct to understand, but the rhythm was hypnotic, repetitive, like a chant or prayer. Weber pressed his ear to the floor, trying to make out the words. Gradually, the pattern became clear. The children were reciting names, dates, and what sounded like promises or oaths. The session lasted nearly an hour, with pauses between sections where other voices, adult voices, added instructions or corrections. When the recitation ended, individual children were called forward for what Ezra termed private lessons. These sessions lasted varying lengths of time, and they were conducted in complete silence except for occasional sharp intakes of breath that might have been pain or fear or both. Weber tried the door latch, confirming what he already knew. He was locked in until Ezra decided to release him. The window was indeed nailed shut, and even if he could break the glass, the drop to the ground was far enough to guarantee injury. His service weapon was gone. When had they taken it? During dinner? While he was washing his hands? From below came the sound of a child sobbing, quickly stifled, then silence again. The education would continue until morning. Dawn came gray and reluctant to Blackwood Hollow, filtered through mist that seemed thicker than the night before. Weber woke to the sound of his door being unlatched from outside. Ruth appeared with a breakfast tray, her movements efficient but careful to avoid eye contact. The food smelled good. Eggs, bacon, fresh biscuits. But Weber's appetite had vanished sometime during the night. "Mr. Ezra wants to show you the boundaries," Ruth said quietly. "Says you should understand the full scope of family holdings before you report back to the county." Her voice carried no emotion, but Weber caught the slight emphasis on certain words. She was trying to warn him about something, though the message was coded in language too subtle for him to interpret. Ezra appeared in the doorway, dressed for riding and carrying Weber's confiscated service weapon in a leather holster. "Beautiful morning for a survey," he said. returning the gun with a smile that suggested he knew exactly how useless it would be. Thought we'd ride the boundary markers, let you see how much territory the family actually controls. The horses were saddled and waiting, including Weber's brown gelding, which seemed nervous and kept trying to turn back toward the hollow's mouth. Ezra rode a massive black stallion that moved with predatory grace, and Daniel accompanied them on a bay mare that looked capable of running down anything that tried to flee. They rode in single file along paths that seemed to multiply as they climbed higher into the mountains. Each trail was marked with symbols carved into trees, spirals, interconnected circles, and other designs that felt both ancient and threatening. The marks appeared fresh despite their primitive style, as if they were regularly renewed or extended. Jeremiah blazed most of these trails, Ezra explained, pausing at a junction where 5 paths converged around a standing stone. But each generation adds their own marks. Daniel here has been extending the northern boundary since he turned 18. The stone bore carvings that made Weber's skin crawl, human figures in postures of submission or torment, surrounded by symbols that suggested ritual or ceremony. At the base of the stone, the ground was stained dark with what might have been old blood or might have been iron-rich mud. "How much land does your family actually control?" Weber asked. "Control is a strong word," Ezra said. "We're responsible for maybe 30,000 acres, from the ridgeline down to the floodplain. But responsibility goes both ways. The land provides for us, and we provide for it." They'd been riding for 2 hours and hadn't encountered a single other human being. No neighboring farms, no hunting camps, no signs that anyone else had ever used these trails. The Blackwood family existed in complete isolation, accountable to no external authority and subject to no laws except those they made for themselves. At the highest point of their journey, Ezra stopped beside a cairn of stacked stones that commanded a view of the entire hollow. From this vantage point, Weber could see the full extent of Blackwood territory. A vast bowl of forest and meadow completely surrounded by ridges too steep for casual travel. The compound below looked like a toy village, perfect and isolated and utterly cut off from the outside world. "Now you understand," Ezra said, his voice carrying satisfaction, "why we do things our own way." The ride back to the compound took them past markers Weber hadn't noticed on the morning journey. Wooden posts driven into the ground at regular intervals, each bearing what looked like articles of clothing or personal effects. A man's hat, weathered by years of mountain weather. A woman's shawl, faded but still recognizable as store-bought fabric. A child's shoe, small enough to fit a 6-year-old. "Trail markers," Ezra explained, when Weber's curiosity finally overcame his caution. "Help us remember visitors who lost their way over the years. What happened to them? Same thing that happens to anyone who wanders too far from civilization. Mountains are dangerous. Easy to get lost, fall down a cliff, run into a bear or wildcat. We find the remains sometimes, but usually too late to help." But the personal effects weren't arranged randomly. They followed a pattern that led directly to the compound, and they were too well preserved to have been exposed to weather for decades. Someone had been collecting these items, maintaining them, displaying them as warnings or trophies. The mailman's bag hung from a post, less than a mile from the compound. Weber's throat went dry as he recognized the leather satchel with its brass Postal Service emblem. The bag had been slit open and its contents scattered, but the identification tag was still legible. "Property of Harold Jenks, Rural Route 7. "Found that just last week," Ezra said, following Weber's gaze. "Poor fellow must have gotten confused, taken a wrong turn somewhere. We looked for him, of course, but mountain country can swallow a man without a trace. They both knew that was a lie. Harold Jenks had been murdered, like all the others who'd ventured too deep into Blackwood territory. The clothing and personal effects marked graves, not accident sites. This isolated hollow was a killing ground that had been operating for generations. How many? Weber asked, though he already dreaded the answer. How many what? How many people have died in this hollow since your grandfather's time? Ezra considered the question with the careful attention of a man doing mathematics. Hard to say exactly. 79 years is a long time, and mountain records aren't always complete. But we've been consistent in our responsibilities. Anyone who threatened family safety, anyone who couldn't understand our ways, he shrugged. The land provides for its own. The number was in the dozens at minimum, possibly over 100. An entire century of systematic murder, hidden in a valley where no outside authority had ever thought to look. You can't hide this forever, Weber said, though his voice carried no conviction. Deputy, we've been hiding it successfully since 1868. Why would that change now? Fear becomes truth. They reached the compound as the afternoon light began to fail, filtering through mist that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The children were gathered in the main yard, standing in their familiar military formation, while Ruth moved among them with what appeared to be medical supplies. As Weber watched, she applied fresh bandages to Rebecca's left hand, covering the family scar that had been reopened during the previous night's education. The sight crystallized everything Weber had learned during his time in the hollow. The systematic abuse, the isolation, the generations of murder disguised as mountain justice. These children were being tortured into compliance, while their parents eliminated anyone who might interfere with the family's terrible tradition. Time for evening lessons, Ezra announced, dismounting from his black stallion. Deputy Weber should observe our teaching methods firsthand, since he'll be reporting back to the county about our educational standards. But Weber knew he wouldn't be reporting anything to anyone. His horse had been led away by Daniel, who was already removing the saddle and bridle with the efficient movements of someone disposing of evidence. Ruth had disappeared into the main house, taking the children with her, and Ezra was walking toward the teaching barn with the patient stride of a man conducting routine business. I've seen enough, Weber said, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. I need to return to town tonight. Afraid that's not possible. Weather's turning. Trails will be dangerous in the dark. You'll stay another night. Leave in the morning when visibility improves. Through the barn's open door, Weber could see the chair bolted to the floor, the anatomical charts, the instruments arranged with surgical precision. This was where he would die, where his body would join the dozens of others who had learned too much about Blackwood family traditions. But as Ezra gestured for him to enter the barn, Weber made a decision that surprised them both. Instead of complying, he turned toward the main house and began walking. Not running, not fleeing, just walking with deliberate purpose toward the front door. Ruth! He called loudly enough for his voice to carry across the compound. I need those children brought out here. All of them. Now. Ezra's expression didn't change, but his hand moved to the knife on his belt. Deputy, you're making this more difficult than necessary. Mary Blackwood, Weber shouted, ignoring the patriarch entirely. Samuel, Rebecca, Joshua, Patience, come outside, all of you. The front door opened, and Ruth emerged with the children clustered behind her. Their faces showed the blank compliance Weber had come to expect, but something flickered in Mary's eyes. Hope, perhaps, or just curiosity about why an adult was calling their names instead of simply issuing orders. "You children listen to me," Weber said, knowing these might be his last words. "What happens in that barn isn't education. It's not love. It's not protection. It's cruelty, and no child deserves it, no matter what anyone tells you." The children stood frozen, caught between their conditioned obedience to family authority and the first outside voice that had ever spoken directly to their suffering. The mailman's horse returned alone on October 18, 1947, just as Harold Jenks's mount had done 3 days earlier. Sheriff Tom Henley found Deputy Weber's service weapon in Blackwood Hollow, along with his badge and the county papers he'd been carrying. The official report listed his death as accidental, the result of a fall from a cliff trail during adverse weather conditions. No one investigated further. Mountain country was dangerous, and men sometimes died in it for reasons that defied explanation. The fact that 2 county employees had perished in the same remote hollow within a week was noted, but not pursued. There were more pressing matters to attend to, and the Blackwoods had always been quiet, law-abiding citizens who caused no trouble for anyone. The children Weber had tried to save remained in the hollow, subject to the same education that had shaped their parents and grandparents before them. Mary eventually married one of her distant cousins and produced children who learned the family traditions. Samuel took over boundary patrol duties when Daniel died in 1963. The cycle continued unbroken. In 1974, the last confirmed Blackwood left the hollow, abandoning the compound to weather and decay. The family had dwindled through inbreeding and isolation until maintaining their territorial claims became impossible. They scattered to other mountain communities, carrying their learned silence and learned cruelty into new places where no one knew their history. The hollow stands empty now, though locals report that smoke still rises from the abandoned buildings on certain foggy mornings. Hunters avoid the area, claiming their dogs refuse to track game into the valley. The trail markers remain in place, weathered but still recognizable to anyone who knows what they represent. But on October nights when the mist rolls, thick through eastern Kentucky, old-timers swear they can still hear children's voices echoing from Blackwood Hollow, not playing or laughing, but reciting lessons that no child should ever learn. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.